My boyfriend's mother wanted me gone. She lost her son instead. Colin and I had been dating for 2 years when I first met his mother, Diane. We'd been taking things slow because he warned me she was difficult about girlfriends, but I figured how bad it could be. I worked as a physical therapist at the rehabilitation center downtown, had my own apartment, and my parents owned a small bakery that had been in our neighborhood for 20 years. Colin was finishing his residency at the hospital, and we were talking about moving in together. The first meeting was at a restaurant Colin picked specifically because Diane liked it. She showed up 20 minutes late, looked me up and down, and asked Colin why he didn't mention I was ethnic. I'm Italian. She spent the entire dinner asking about my real job, because physical therapy wasn't a career for someone dating a future doctor. She asked if my parents were legal citizens. They were born in Philadelphia. She asked if I was dating Colin for his money. He was still in residency, making less than I. Colin kept trying to redirect the conversation, but she'd just talk over him. After that, every interaction got worse. She'd call Colin while we were together and tell him she saw a nice girl at her country club he should meet. When he'd say he was with me, she'd say that was temporary. She showed up at his apartment when I was there and acted shocked that I was still around. She told me Colin's ex, Rebecca, was getting divorced and had been asking about him. She said Rebecca's father was a judge, which would be so helpful for Colin's career. Colin told her to stop. She said she was just making conversation. For his birthday, she threw him a party and told me the wrong address. When I finally showed up 2 hours late after Colin called worried, she announced to everyone that I couldn't even bother showing up on time for important events. Colin corrected her in front of everyone. She said mistakes happen. She started calling me the wrong name. Called me Bethany, Catherine, Jessica, anything but my actual name, Natalie. Colin would correct her every time. She'd say she was bad with names, even though she remembered every nurse, receptionist, and barista's name perfectly. Then came the confrontation that ended everything. Colin was on call at the hospital and Diane showed up at my apartment. She said we needed to have a woman-to-woman talk. She told me Colin would never marry someone like me because I didn't understand their social circle. She said my parents were nice people, but they were shopkeepers, and that wasn't the kind of family connection Colin needed for his career. Then she said my parents probably pushed me to date above my station because immigrants always want their kids to marry up. My parents aren't immigrants, but whatever. She said they must be so proud I trapped a doctor, but that Colin would wise up eventually. That's when I lost it. I told her she was right. Colin deserved better than having to manage his mother's jealousy for the rest of his life. I said any woman who married him would be signing up for decades of her manipulation, and I wasn't interested in that life. I told her she won, and I was done. She actually smiled and said she knew I'd see reason eventually. Colin called me an hour later from the hospital after getting texts from his mother about how I came to her house and said horrible things before announcing I was dumping him. I told him what actually happened. He drove straight from the hospital to my apartment. He was crying and begging me not to let her win. But I was exhausted. I told him I loved him, but I couldn't spend my life fighting his mother for basic respect. We broke up that night. Diane called Colin the next day to check on him and said maybe now he could reconnect with Rebecca. That's when Colin completely shut down. He stopped answering Diane's calls. He picked up extra shifts at the hospital to avoid going home. He started sleeping in the on-call room even when he wasn't on call. His colleagues told me later he'd lost 15 pounds in the first month. His father tried to get him to come to family dinners, but Colin refused if Diane would be there. She kept insisting he was being dramatic and would get over it. 3 months after our breakup, Colin had to take medical leave because he made a mistake during a procedure from exhaustion. Nothing serious happened, but it scared him. His attending physician told his parents Colin was showing signs of severe depression. 5 months after our breakup, I met James at my cousin's wedding. He was a firefighter, coached Little League on weekends, and his mother immediately invited me to Sunday dinners. Colin somehow found out through mutual friends. His friend told me Colin hadn't been to his parents' house since we broke up. 6 months later, things got weird. Diane started showing up at my work. First, she just watched me from her car. Then she came inside and sat in the waiting room. Finally, she approached me in tears. She begged me to take Colin back. I stare at Diane standing in my workplace waiting room, tears streaming down her face, and my first instinct is to call security. My coworkers are watching this woman who spent months making my life hell now begging me to save her son. She looks smaller than I remember, like something broke inside her and left her hollow. I walk past her toward the break room and she follows, her heels clicking against the tile floor. My supervisor glances up from her desk with raised eyebrows, but I shake my head slightly, signaling I can handle this. Diane follows me to the parking lot when I refuse to talk inside, and she's saying Colin hasn't eaten a real meal in weeks. He's living at the hospital. He won't see anyone. Her voice cracks on his name, and I feel my chest tighten despite everything. I tell her she got exactly what she wanted and she needs to leave me alone. I unlock my car and she steps closer, blocking the door. She grabs my arm and says Colin made another medication error last week, a serious one that nearly hurt a patient. Her fingers dig into my sleeve and I pull away, but she keeps talking. The hospital is talking about ending his residency entirely, not just medical leave, and she's scared he'll lose everything he worked for. Her makeup is running down her cheeks in black streaks, and part of me feels satisfied seeing her this broken, which makes me feel awful. I get in my car and lock the doors while she stands there crying in the parking lot. I drive home shaking because part of me wants Colin to be okay, and part of me is mad that Diane thinks she can use me again. My hands grip the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turn white. James is cooking dinner when I get there, and I can't even explain what just happened without crying. He turns off the stove and guides me to the couch, his hands steady on my shoulders. James holds me while I tell him about Diane's visit, and he's quiet for a long time before asking what I want to do. I say I don't know, which is the truth, because 6 months ago I loved Colin enough to imagine marrying him. James doesn't say anything else, just rubs small circles on my back while I try to stop shaking. That night I can't sleep and I find myself looking at Colin's social media for the first time since the breakup. His last post is from 4 months ago, a bland hospital photo, and he looks tired even then. His face is thinner in the picture and there's something empty in his eyes that wasn't there before. I scroll through older photos and see us together at a restaurant, both of us laughing at something off camera. I close the app and stare at the ceiling until morning. The next day, Diane calls my phone 12 times before I block her number. She starts calling the rehab center asking for me until my supervisor pulls me aside and asks if I need help with a stalking situation. I explain briefly about Colin's mom, and my supervisor says she'll handle it if Diane shows up again. By lunch, 3 of my coworkers have asked if I'm okay, and I realize everyone in the building knows something weird is happening. I agree to meet Diane at a coffee shop just to make her stop bothering my workplace. She shows me photos of Colin on her phone, and he looks terrible, thin and pale with dark circles under his eyes, and she admits she didn't realize how serious his feelings for me were until it was too late. She swipes through picture after picture, each one worse than the last. Diane tells me she thought Colin would get over the breakup in a few weeks like his previous relationships, but this time he completely shut down. She says she's been to 3 family therapists who all told her she caused this by messing with our relationship, and she finally understands she destroyed her son's happiness. Her voice drops to almost a whisper, and she won't look at me when she talks. I ask Diane why she thinks I would help after everything she did to drive me away. She says she doesn't deserve my help, but Colin does, and she's willing to do whatever it takes, including staying completely out of our lives if we get back together. She reaches across the table like she might grab my hand but stops herself. I stand up to leave and she starts crying again, begging me to just think about it. I stand up from the coffee shop table and walk toward the door without looking back at her. She calls my name, but I keep going, pushing through the glass door into the parking lot where the afternoon sun hits my face. My car sits 3 rows back and I fumble with my keys, hands shaking from anger or maybe something else I don't want to name. I slide into the driver's seat and lock the doors, watching through the window as she stands outside the coffee shop entrance, phone pressed to her ear. She's probably calling Colin right now to tell him she tried. The engine starts and I back out of the parking space, forcing myself not to look at her again. Traffic moves slow on the way home and I grip the steering wheel, thinking about everything she said, the photos of Colin looking like death, her tears that might actually be real this time. My phone sits in the cup holder and I glance at it twice before pulling over into a gas station parking lot. I scroll through my contacts until I find her name, the one person who was there when I met James and knows the whole messy history. The phone rings 3 times before she picks up. I tell her about the coffee shop, about the photos, about how Diane looked genuinely broken instead of manipulative. She listens without interrupting, and when I finish, she asks the question I've been avoiding since James made dinner last night. The words hang in the air between us, and I realize I've been dating James because his family is easy, because his mom smiles when I walk through the door, because there's no battle to fight. But easy isn't the same as right, and I don't know how to explain that without sounding ungrateful. She tells me to be honest with myself before I make any decisions, and we hang up after she makes me promise to call her tomorrow. I sit in my car outside the gas station for another 10 minutes before driving home, my mind spinning through memories I thought I'd packed away. That night, James makes pasta and asks about my day, and I can't lie to him about where I went or who I saw. He sets down his fork and looks at me across the table, really looks at me and asks if I'm thinking about Colin. The truth comes out easier than I expected, and I tell him yes, that Diane's visit stirred up everything I thought I'd moved past. He nods slowly and says he appreciates me being honest instead of pretending everything is fine. We finish dinner in quiet, and he doesn't push me for more. Doesn't demand I make a choice right now. Just holds my hand while we clean up the dishes. The next morning at work, I can't focus on my patients and my supervisor notices, asking if I'm okay during my lunch break. I tell her I'm fine, but she doesn't believe me and suggests I take the afternoon off if I need space to think. Instead, I text Hugo, Colin's friend who works in the same hospital, asking if we can meet for coffee after his shift. He responds within minutes saying yes and suggests a place near the hospital at 6. The rest of my workday drags and I keep checking the clock, nervous about what Hugo might tell me. At 5:40, I leave the rehab center and drive to the coffee shop, arriving early and ordering tea I don't actually want. Hugo walks in at 6 exactly, still wearing his scrubs, and he looks tired in a way that makes me think the hospital is grinding him down too. He sits across from me and I ask him directly how bad things really are with Colin. No sugarcoating, just the truth. His face goes serious and he tells me Colin is barely holding it together, that he's lost something essential that made him good at his job. The attending doctors are worried about him making mistakes from exhaustion and depression, worried he might hurt himself or a patient because he's running on empty. Hugo says Colin works double shifts, then sleeps in the on-call room to avoid going home, eating maybe once a day if someone forces food on him. The hospital made him see a therapist, but Colin just goes through the motions, showing up to appointments but not actually engaging with treatment. Hugo leans forward and says he thinks I'm the only person who might actually get through to Colin because nothing else has worked. I ask why he thinks that, and he says, because Colin refuses to even say my name, won't talk about the breakup, acts like acknowledging what happened would make it too real. Hugo finishes his coffee and tells me he's not asking me to fix Colin, just maybe talk to him once and then he leaves for his next shift. I drive home feeling like someone dropped a weight on my chest. James is at practice with his team, and I'm alone in the apartment, staring at my phone and thinking about Hugo's words. A week passes and I can't stop thinking about what Hugo said. James notices I'm distracted during dinner, during movies, during the normal moments that should feel comfortable. Finally, he asks me straight out if I'm thinking about Colin, and I tell him yes because lying would be worse. I explain about meeting Hugo, about learning how bad Colin's depression has gotten, about feeling responsible even though I know I'm not. James is quiet for a long time, and then he says he appreciates me not lying to him, that honesty matters more than pretending. He doesn't get angry or defensive, just sad in a way that makes me feel worse than yelling would. That night, I lie awake until 2 in the morning. Then I grab my phone from the nightstand. My hands shake as I scroll to Colin's number, the one I never deleted even though I should have. I press call before I can change my mind, and it rings once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, and on the 5th ring, he answers. His voice sounds thick with sleep, and I say his name. Just his name. Nothing else. Complete silence follows, and it stretches so long I think he hung up. Think maybe I imagined him answering. Then he says my name like a question, like he can't believe I'm actually calling, like maybe he's still dreaming. We talk for 15 minutes and his voice sounds hollow, broken in a way that scares me more than Hugo's description did. He apologizes for his mother, for everything that happened, for not being strong enough to stand up to her sooner. He says he doesn't blame me for leaving, that I was right to protect myself, but he can't figure out how to function without me, and he knows that's not fair to put on me. I tell him he needs real help, actual therapy, where he's honest instead of just showing up. He admits he hasn't been truthful with his therapist because talking about losing me makes it too real, makes it permanent. He says seeing photos of me with James on social media felt like proof that I moved on easily while he fell apart. Colin asks if I'm happy with James, and I open my mouth to say yes, but the word gets stuck. The pause stretches too long and he catches it, tells me he doesn't want to mess up my life again. But if there's any chance I still have feelings for him, he'll do whatever it takes to fix things, including finally standing up to his mother the way he should have from the start. I tell him I need time to think, and he says he understands, that he'll wait as long as it takes. We hang up, and I sit on my couch in the dark apartment, James still at practice with his team. Tears run down my face, and I realize I'm crying because I never stopped loving Colin. I just learned how to live without him, learned to build a life that didn't hurt every single day. I wipe my face and check the time. James won't be back from practice for another hour. I stand up and go to the kitchen, pour myself water, drink it without tasting anything. My phone sits on the counter and I stare at it like it might explode. The silence in the apartment feels too loud. I walk back to the couch and sit down again. The cushion still has the indent from where I was sitting before. I should eat something, but the thought makes my stomach twist. I pick up my phone and scroll through nothing, just moving my thumb to have something to do. An hour passes like this. Then I hear James's key in the lock. He comes in smelling like grass and sweat, his practice bag over his shoulder. He takes one look at my face and stops in the doorway. I watch him register that something happened, watch him put his bag down slowly. He sits next to me on the couch and waits. I tell him about Colin's call, about the hollow sound in his voice, about how he apologized and said he doesn't blame me but can't function without me. James listens without interrupting. When I finish, he's quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. Then he looks at me and says he's known for a while that part of me was still somewhere else. He says it so calmly, like he's been carrying this knowledge around and finally gets to set it down. He says he deserves someone who's completely present in the relationship. I start to protest, but he holds up his hand. He tells me he cares about me, really cares, but he won't be someone's second choice. The words come out before I can stop them. I tell him he's not second choice. He's the safe choice. The second it leaves my mouth, I know it's wrong. I watch his face change, watch him process what I just said. It hurts both of us because it's true and we both know it. He stands up and walks to the window. I stay on the couch. We sit with that truth between us for what feels like forever. Finally, James turns around and says he thinks I need to figure out my feelings for Colin before we can move forward. He suggests we take a break. Not a breakup. Just space for me to work through whatever is happening in my head. I want to argue, but I can't, because he's right. I've been emotionally checked out since Hugo told me about Colin's depression, maybe even before that. Staying with James while my heart is somewhere else isn't fair to him. I agree, even though it hurts. He nods like he expected this answer. We spend the rest of the evening in careful politeness, both of us moving around each other like strangers. That night, I sleep in the guest room. The next week, I move my stuff back to my own apartment. James helps me carry boxes, which makes everything worse. The apartment feels different from it did 6 months ago when I first moved in with him. Back then, it felt empty because I was alone. Now it feels empty because I chose to be. I unpack slowly, putting things back where they used to go. My coffee maker on the counter, my books on the shelf, my photos on the wall. Everything fits back into place like I never left. Celine shows up that evening with 2 bottles of wine. She doesn't ask if I want company, just walks in and starts opening cabinets looking for glasses. We sit on my couch and she pours. She asks what I'm going to do. I tell her I don't know. I say I still have feelings for Colin, but I don't know if I can trust that things would be different. Diane could be in therapy now, but what happens in 6 months when therapy ends and she decides she's fixed? What happens when Colin and I get serious again and she starts testing boundaries? Celine drinks her wine and says that's a valid concern. She asks if I think Colin would actually stand up to his mother this time. I tell her he says he would, but he said that before too, back when we were together, and it never happened. Celine refills both our glasses. She tells me that people can change, but it takes more than just wanting to. She asks if I'm willing to risk getting hurt again to find out. I don't have an answer. 3 days later, Frank calls me. I stare at his name on my phone screen for 3 rings before answering. He asks if we can meet for coffee. I'm so surprised I almost dropped my phone. Frank never reached out during my entire relationship with Colin. He stayed neutral, stayed quiet, let Diane run the show while he watched from the sidelines. I ask why, and he says he needs to talk to me about something important. I agree to meet him the next morning at a cafe near my apartment. I spend the rest of the day wondering what he wants. Maybe Diane sent him. Maybe this is another manipulation attempt. I almost cancel twice, but curiosity wins. Frank is already there when I arrive, sitting at a corner table with 2 coffees in front of him. He stands when he sees me, gestures to the chair across from him. I sit and he pushes 1 coffee toward me. He remembered I take it with cream and sugar. We make small talk for about 30 seconds before he cuts himself off mid-sentence. He says he's ashamed he didn't stand up to Diane when she was treating me badly. The words come out rushed like he practiced them. He tells me he thought staying neutral was keeping peace in the family. He believed if he didn't take sides, then everyone would eventually calm down and work things out. But he realizes now he was just enabling her controlling behavior. He says it cost Colin his happiness and he'll never forgive himself for that. I don't know what to say, so I drink my coffee. Frank keeps talking. He explains that Diane's parents were immigrants who came here with nothing. They struggled financially her entire childhood, never had stability or security. Diane grew up watching them work 3 jobs and still barely make rent. She became obsessed with social status and financial security as a result. When she married Frank, she thought she'd finally escaped that instability. She fixated on Colin marrying someone from what she considered the right background, because in her mind, that was the only way to guarantee he'd never struggle like her parents did. Frank says it doesn't excuse her behavior, but it helps explain why she reacted so badly to me. She saw my parents' bakery and my normal job and panicked that Colin was choosing struggle over security. I listen to this, and part of me understands, but most of me is still angry. Lots of people grow up poor and don't become controlling nightmares to their kids' partners. Frank tells me he's been going to therapy himself for the past 2 months. He's learning about enmeshment and controlling parenting, about how his silence enabled Diane's worst impulses. He says he's told Diane she needs intensive therapy if she wants any relationship with Colin going forward. Real therapy, not just a few sessions to say she tried. He's prepared to separate from her if she won't change. I ask if he means that, and he looks me straight in the eye and says yes. He says watching Colin fall apart opened his eyes to how damaged their family dynamic has become. He's not willing to lose his son to protect his marriage. Diane is in therapy now, actually working on her issues with a therapist who specializes in controlling parents. But Frank says real change takes time and there's no guarantee she'll succeed. Some people go to therapy and learn to fake progress without actually changing. He doesn't know which category Diane will fall into yet. I ask Frank why he's telling me all this. He sets his coffee down and looks tired suddenly. He says because I deserve to know the family dynamics before deciding anything about Colin. He wants me to understand what I'd be walking back into. Diane is trying, but she's not fixed. She might never be fixed. If I give Colin another chance, I need to go in with my eyes open about his mother. He says Diane has good weeks where she respects boundaries and bad weeks where she backslides into old patterns. Frank is working on holding her accountable, but it's not perfect. I appreciate his honesty, even though it makes the decision harder. At least he's not pretending everything is magically better now. Frank admits he's terrified they've permanently damaged Colin and destroyed his chance at happiness with me. His voice cracks when he says it. He tells me Colin was always a happy kid, easy to please, eager to make everyone proud. Watching him become hollow and broken has been the worst experience of Frank's life. He says if I decide to give Colin another chance, he'll personally ensure Diane respects boundaries. Even if that means she doesn't see Colin for a while. Even if that means choosing between his wife and his son. He'll choose his son this time. I believe him because I can see it in his face, the guilt and determination mixed together. He stands to leave and puts his hand on my shoulder for just a second. He tells me to take my time deciding, that Colin will wait as long as I need. Then he's gone, and I'm sitting alone with cold coffee and more information than I had before, but no clearer answer about what to do. I spend the next 2 days replaying Frank's words in my head while I try to work. My patients notice I'm distracted, and one of them asks if I'm okay. I tell her I'm fine, but she gives me this look like she knows I'm lying. On Thursday morning, I call the therapist my insurance covers and schedule an appointment for that afternoon. The receptionist says they had a cancellation, and I take it before I can talk myself out of going. The office is in a building downtown with beige walls and generic landscape paintings. I fill out paperwork asking about my mental health history and relationship status, and I realize I don't know what to put for that last one anymore. The therapist is a woman in her 50s named Dr. Walsh who has kind eyes and doesn't push me to talk before I'm ready. I tell her about Colin and Diane and the breakup and James and Frank's visit, and how I don't know what I actually want anymore. She listens without interrupting and then asks me what I want, not what I think I should want, or what makes the most sense. I open my mouth to answer and nothing comes out because I haven't let myself think about it that way. She waits, and I finally admit I want Colin, but I'm scared of going through everything with Diane again and ending up more hurt than before. Dr. Walsh writes something down and asks why I'm more scared of being hurt again than I was the first time. I think about it and realize it's because last time I could tell myself we just weren't meant to be. But if I try again and it fails, I'll know for sure that even love isn't enough to fix some situations. Dr. Walsh points out that I left James's stability to even consider Colin again. She says that suggests my feelings run deeper than I've been admitting to myself. I want to argue, but she's right because James was everything I thought I wanted after the disaster with Diane. His mother liked me and his life was simple and there was no drama. But I still couldn't stop thinking about Colin even when I was sitting at James's family dinners. Dr. Walsh says the question isn't whether I love Colin because clearly I do. The real question is whether I believe the situation can actually be different this time, or if I'm setting myself up for the same pain. She asks what would need to change for me to feel safe trying again. I list things like Colin setting real boundaries with Diane and sticking to them even when it's hard, and Frank actually backing him up instead of staying neutral, and Diane doing real therapy work instead of just going through the motions. Dr. Walsh asks if I think those things are possible, and I say I don't know, but Frank seemed genuine when he talked about choosing Colin over protecting his marriage. I leave therapy feeling more confused than when I went in, but at least I'm thinking about the right questions now. That night, I text Hugo and ask if we can talk. He calls me 20 minutes later, and I ask him honestly about Colin's therapy progress. Hugo says something shifted after our phone call, and Colin finally opened up to his therapist about everything. He's going to sessions twice a week now and actually being honest about his depression instead of pretending he's fine. Hugo says Colin's therapist thinks he's making real progress, but it's going to take time. I ask how much time, and Hugo laughs and says that's not how therapy works. There's no finish line where suddenly everything is fixed. But Colin is trying, and that's more than he was doing before. Hugo asks if I'm thinking about giving Colin another chance, and I tell him maybe, but I need to see the changes for myself first. He says that's fair, and tells me Colin asks about me sometimes, but never pushes Hugo to share information. I appreciate that because it means Colin is respecting my space even though I know he wants to talk. 2 days later, I text Colin and ask if he wants to meet for coffee. He responds within a minute saying yes and asking when. We agree on Saturday afternoon at a coffee shop halfway between our apartments. I spend the next 3 days alternating between thinking this is a huge mistake and hoping things could actually be different. Saturday comes and I get to the coffee shop 15 minutes early because I'm nervous. I order tea I don't really want and sit at a corner table where I can see the door. Colin walks in exactly on time and I barely recognize him at first. He's lost more weight than I realized and his face looks thin and pale. He has dark circles under his eyes like he hasn't slept properly in months. He spots me and walks over and something breaks open in my chest seeing him like this. I stand up and we do this awkward half hug and then sit down across from each other. Colin apologizes right away for how he looks. He says he knows he's a mess and he's working on it. I tell him he doesn't need to apologize for that, and we sit in uncomfortable silence for a minute before he asks how I've been. We talk for 2 hours about everything that happened, and Colin takes full responsibility for not setting boundaries with his mother sooner. He doesn't make excuses or try to blame Diane's behavior on her childhood or anything like that. He just says he should have protected our relationship and he didn't, and he's sorry. I tell him I'm sorry too for giving up without fighting harder, but he shakes his head and says, I shouldn't have had to fight at all. He says his mother's behavior was wrong and he should have shut it down from the beginning instead of trying to keep everyone happy. Colin tells me he's been working with his therapist on understanding why he let Diane control his relationships for so long. He explains that he was raised to keep peace at all costs and to prioritize his mother's feelings above everything else. His therapist helped him see that he never learned it was okay to choose his own happiness over her approval. He says growing up, anytime he disagreed with Diane, she would cry or get angry or give him the silent treatment until he apologized and did what she wanted. His father would tell him to just go along with it to keep the peace. So he learned that his own needs didn't matter as much as keeping his mother calm. His therapist calls it enmeshment and says it's going to take work to unlearn those patterns. Colin says he's committed to doing that work because he can't live like this anymore. He talks about how empty he's felt since we broke up, and how he finally understands that his mother's love came with conditions that were destroying him. I listen and watch his face while he talks, and I can see he means it. This isn't just words to get me back. He's actually thought about this and worked on it. Colin says he's not asking me to take him back right now because he knows he needs to prove he's actually changing. He asks if I'd be willing to stay in contact while he works on himself, and maybe eventually we could try again if I'm still open to it. His voice cracks a little when he says it, and I realize how hard this is for him, asking for something without knowing if he'll get it. I tell him I still have feelings for him, but I'm scared. I need to see real change before I can consider getting back together because I can't go through that nightmare with Diane again. Colin nods and says that's fair. He promises he'll do whatever it takes, including family therapy with his parents and maintaining strict boundaries with Diane. He says he'd rather lose his mother than lose me again, and I believe him because I can see it in his eyes. We finish our coffee and walk out together. Colin asks if he can text me, and I say yes. He doesn't try to hug me again, just says thank you for meeting him and walks to his car. I watch him go and feel this weird mix of hope and fear. Over the next few weeks, Colin and I text regularly about small things like how our days went and what we're watching on TV. We meet for coffee 2 more times, and I notice he's gaining weight back and looks healthier. His eyes aren't as hollow, and he smiles occasionally when he talks about work. He tells me his therapist says he's making genuine progress and learning to recognize when he's falling into old patterns of putting his mother's needs first. Colin starts going to the gym again and picks up his guitar that he hadn't touched in months. I can see him coming back to life slowly, and it makes me want to believe things could work. Then Diane calls me on a Tuesday afternoon. I stare at her name on my phone screen and almost don't answer. But I pick up and she asks if she can apologize in person. I'm immediately suspicious because this feels like another manipulation. I tell her I hang up and call Colin right away. He says his therapist actually thinks it might be helpful for Diane's accountability if she apologizes to me directly. He offers to be there as a buffer if I agree to meet her. I think about it for 2 days before texting Diane that I'll meet her, but only with Colin present. She agrees immediately, and we set up a time for the following Saturday at a restaurant. Saturday arrives and Colin picks me up from my apartment because we agreed it would be better to show up together. The restaurant is one of those places with white tablecloths and servers who refill water glasses every 5 minutes, somewhere neutral that doesn't belong to any of us. Diane is already sitting at a corner table when we walk in, her hands folded in her lap, and she stands up when she sees us like she's not sure if she should hug Colin or shake my hand. She does neither, just sits back down and waits for us to take our seats across from her. Colin pulls out my chair and I notice his hand is shaking slightly when he touches my shoulder. Diane launches into her apology before the server even brings menus, and I can tell immediately someone coached her on what to say, because the words sound practiced. She apologizes specifically for her racist comments about my family being immigrants, for telling me the wrong address to Colin's birthday party, for showing up at my apartment to drive me away. She lists each thing like items on a checklist, and her voice stays steady and controlled the whole time. When she finishes the first part, she takes a breath and starts explaining that her therapist helped her understand she was trying to control Colin's life because she felt powerless in her own childhood. She talks about how her parents struggled with money and status, how she grew up feeling like she never had enough, how she became obsessed with making sure Colin had security and connections. The whole time she's talking, I'm watching her face and I can see she means some of it, but there's something rehearsed about the delivery that makes me wonder how much is genuine understanding versus what her therapist told her to say. She admits she saw me as a threat to her relationship with Colin instead of seeing me as a person, and she's working on understanding why she felt so threatened by someone her son loved. That part sounds more real, more painful, and her voice cracks a little when she says it. Diane promises she'll respect whatever boundaries Colin and I set going forward, including limited contact or only seeing us with supervision. She says she'd rather have a distant relationship with Colin than no relationship at all, and she finally understands she was destroying the exact thing she was trying to protect. Her eyes fill with tears when she says this, and I believe that part completely, because I can see the fear in her face, the terror that she's lost her son forever. But then I notice something that bothers me. Every few sentences, she glances at Colin, checking his face for approval or reassurance, looking to see if she's saying the right things. I watched this happen 3 times before I pointed out, telling her she's still looking to Colin for validation, even while apologizing for trying to control him. She gets defensive immediately, her shoulders stiffening and her mouth opening to argue, but then she catches herself and closes her eyes for a second. When she opens them again, she admits I'm right, that it's a habit she's trying to break, but it's harder than she expected. The server comes to take our order, and the interruption feels awkward because none of us have even looked at the menus. We order quickly just to get the server to leave, and then we sit in uncomfortable silence while Diane twists her napkin in her lap. After Diane leaves, walking to her car with her shoulders hunched like she's carrying something heavy, Colin and I stay at the table and talk about whether her apology felt genuine. I tell him she's clearly working on things with her therapist, but she still has those controlling instincts just below the surface, and I'm worried about what happens when therapy ends, and real-life tests whether her progress is real or just performance. Colin stares at his untouched food and nods slowly, and I can see he's thinking the same thing. He says his therapist warned him that his mother's change will be gradual and imperfect, that she spent decades building these patterns, and they won't disappear just because she understands them now. The difference now, he says, is that he's committed to maintaining boundaries even when it's uncomfortable, even when his mother cries or his father calls asking him to give her another chance. He looks directly at me when he says he's not going to sacrifice our relationship to manage his mother's feelings anymore, and I can hear in his voice that he means it. We finish our meal without much appetite and drive back to my apartment in silence that feels thoughtful rather than tense. The next morning, I'm making coffee when my phone buzzes with a text from James asking how I'm doing and if I've made any decisions. I stare at the message for a long time before responding, because I know what I need to tell him, but I hate that it's going to hurt. I text back honestly that I'm exploring things with Colin again, trying to see if we can make it work with proper boundaries around his mother. James responds within minutes saying he appreciates me being straight with him, even though it hurts, and that he hopes I know what I'm doing. I do know what I'm doing, or at least I think I do, but there's still that voice in my head asking if I'm making a huge mistake by giving Colin another chance. I delete the text thread and put my phone face down on the counter because looking at it makes my chest feel tight. 2 months pass and Colin and I fall into a routine of weekly dinners and daily texts, rebuilding what we had before but slower this time, more careful. Diane calls him once a week on Sundays, and he keeps the conversations short, ending them when she starts asking too many questions about me or suggesting we all get together. Frank calls me once during this time to thank me for giving Colin another chance, and I can hear the relief in his voice when he talks about how much better Colin seems. Then Colin invites me to a family therapy session with him, his parents, and their therapist, and my first instinct is to say no because sitting in a room with Diane sounds like my personal nightmare. But Colin says his therapist thinks it would be helpful for everyone to be in the same space with a professional mediating, so I agree even though my stomach drops at the thought. The therapy office is in a medical building downtown with bland artwork on the walls and furniture that looks like it came from a catalog. Colin and I arrive first and sit in the waiting room holding hands, both of us tense and quiet. Diane and Frank show up exactly on time, and Diane's face does this complicated thing when she sees me, something between hope and fear and shame all mixed together. The therapist is a woman in her 50s with gray hair and glasses, and she greets us all calmly like we're here for something routine, instead of trying to repair a family that nearly destroyed itself. We sit in a circle, me and Colin on one small couch, Diane and Frank on another, and the therapist in a chair between us. Diane spends the first 20 minutes trying to prove she's changed, talking about her therapy homework and the books she's reading about controlling behavior and enmeshment. She sounds almost eager, like a student trying to show the teacher she did the assignment, and I notice Colin shifting uncomfortably beside me. The therapist lets Diane talk for a while, and then starts pushing her on specific scenarios, asking what Diane would do if Colin and I got engaged, if we decided to move away, if we wanted to spend holidays with my family instead of hers. Diane starts suggesting compromises that sound reasonable at first, but when I listen closer, they're just softer versions of control, little ways she could still influence our decisions and stay involved in every aspect of our lives. The therapist calls out Diane's behavior directly, telling her she's still trying to negotiate outcomes instead of accepting that Colin's life isn't hers to manage. Diane gets upset immediately, her voice rising as she says she's trying her best. She's in therapy twice a week. She's reading books and doing exercises, and what more does everyone want from her? Frank speaks up for the first time and supports the therapist, telling Diane she needs to accept that trying isn't the same as succeeding, and she still has significant work to do. Diane turns to look at Frank with this expression of betrayal, like she can't believe her own husband is siding against her, and I see her eyes fill with tears. The session ends with Diane crying quietly into a tissue while the therapist talks about the difference between understanding your behavior and actually changing it, and I leave feeling exhausted and sad for everyone involved. After the session, Colin and I sit in his car in the parking lot, and he looks more discouraged than I've seen him in weeks. He says he's worried his mother will never really change, that she'll always have these controlling instincts just waiting to come out, and maybe we're fooling ourselves thinking we can have a relationship without her destroying it again. I reach over and take his hand, and I tell him what matters is that he's changing and learning to hold boundaries, that we can work with an imperfect Diane as long as he doesn't let her run our lives. He squeezes my hand and nods, but I can see the doubt in his eyes, the fear that his mother's problems will always be our problems too. We sit there for a while longer, watching other people come and go from their therapy appointments, and I wonder if we're strong enough to build something real with all this damage in the background. A week passes before Colin calls and asks if we can meet for coffee. I spend those 7 days going back and forth in my head about what I actually want, whether I'm ready to try again, whether anything would really be different this time. I think about Diane's tears in the therapy office and Colin's face when he talked about losing me, and I think about the 2 years before everything fell apart when we were actually happy together. I meet him at the same coffee shop where we had our first real conversation after the breakup, and he looks nervous when I sit down across from him. He doesn't waste time with small talk, just asks directly if I'm ready to try being together again officially, with clear boundaries about his mother's involvement. I tell him I've been thinking about it constantly, and I want to try, but I need specific agreements about how we'll handle Diane going forward. He nods immediately and says he expected that he wants the same thing because he can't go through losing me again. We talk for 2 hours about what being together would actually look like, what rules we'd need, what would happen if Diane crosses lines. I tell him I need a few more days to think about the specifics and write down what I actually need from him, and he says he'll do the same so we can compare notes. 3 days later, we meet at my apartment and we both bring notebooks with our lists written out. We sit at my kitchen table and go through everything point by point, writing out actual rules about Diane's access to our relationship. No surprise visits to either of our places, period. No comments about my family or background, and if she makes one, Colin shuts it down immediately and we leave or end the call. Phone calls limited to twice a week maximum unless there's an actual emergency, and Colin gets to define what counts as an emergency. If Diane tries to manipulate or guilt trip, Colin ends the conversation right then and follows through with consequences like reduced contact for a set period. I tell him if he breaks these boundaries even once, if he lets her slide on something because it's easier or he feels guilty, I'm done for good and there won't be another chance. He looks me in the eye and says he understands, that he'd rather lose his mother completely than lose me again, and I believe him because I can see how much the last 7 months broke him. We decide to start dating again officially, taking things slowly and checking in regularly about how things are going. Colin suggests weekly conversations where we specifically talk about any Diane issues or concerns, so nothing builds up under the surface like it did before. I agree and add that I want him to keep going to therapy even when things are good, not just when there's a crisis, and he says his therapist already recommended the same thing. We write everything down and both sign it, which feels kind of formal and weird but also necessary given what we've been through. After we finish with the rules and boundaries, we just sit there looking at each other, and Colin reaches across the table to take my hand. He says he knows we have a long way to go to rebuild trust, but he's committed to doing whatever it takes, and I squeeze his hand back because I want to believe we can actually make this work. The next day I text James and ask if we can meet in person. He responds right away saying he'll come over after his shift ends, and when he shows up at my door that evening, he already looks resigned, like he knows what's coming. We sit on my couch and I tell him straight out that Colin and I are getting back together, that I'm sorry, but I need to be honest that my heart isn't fully available for anyone else right now. James is quiet for a long moment and then says he's sad but not surprised, that he could tell for weeks I was somewhere else emotionally. He says he hopes things work out with Colin, but if they don't, I shouldn't call him as a backup because he deserves someone who chooses him first. I tell him he absolutely deserves that respect, and I won't contact him unless it's to genuinely see how he's doing as a friend, nothing more. He nods and stands up to leave, and at the door he turns back and says, I'm making a mistake going back to someone whose family caused me so much pain, but he hopes I'm right that things will be different this time. Colin and I go on our first real date in 7 months the following weekend, dinner at a restaurant neither of us has been to before, so there's no history attached to the location. It feels both familiar and different sitting across from him, ordering food and talking about our weeks. He's more confident about standing up for what he wants, interrupting me at one point to say he disagrees with something I said, instead of just nodding along like he used to. I'm more willing to speak up when something bothers me instead of trying to keep peace, telling him directly when a comment he makes about my work schedule sounds dismissive. We both notice the changes and talk about them, agreeing that maybe we needed this time apart to figure out how to actually communicate instead of avoiding conflict. The date goes well enough that we schedule another one for the next week and then another, slowly building back the relationship without rushing into the intensity we had before. 3 months into dating again, Colin comes to my apartment one evening looking lighter than I've seen him in months. He tells me he had a major breakthrough in therapy that day, where he confronted his fear of disappointing his mother head-on. His therapist walked him through exercises about whose expectations he's living for, whether his mother's approval is actually necessary for his happiness, what he's willing to sacrifice to maintain her good opinion. Colin says something clicked during the session, where he finally understood that his mother's disappointment is not his responsibility to fix, that her emotional regulation is her own work to do. He talks for an hour about the insights he had, how he's been carrying guilt about her feelings since childhood, how he confused love with obligation. I listen and watch him process out loud, and I can see the weight lifting off his shoulders as he talks through it. Diane tests the boundaries several times over the next few months, calling Colin's phone repeatedly when he doesn't answer the first time, leaving voicemails with subtle comments about how I must be keeping him too busy to talk to his mother. She mentions during one call that she saw someone from my neighborhood, and they said my parents' bakery has been struggling, implying I might be with Colin for financial security after all. Each time Colin shuts it down immediately, telling her the comment is inappropriate and ending the call, then following through with consequences like not answering her calls for a week. After the 3rd or 4th time, Diane starts learning the boundaries are real, that Colin means what he says about reducing contact if she can't respect the rules. Frank calls me separately to apologize for her behavior and assure me he's backing up every consequence Colin implements, even when Diane complains to him about being shut out. Colin's attending physician calls him in for a meeting 5 months after he returned to limited duties, and Colin is nervous it's bad news about his performance. Instead, the doctor tells him he's cleared to return to full duties at the hospital after seeing his progress in therapy and his improved mental health scores. The doctor says Colin's work has been consistently strong, his focus is back, and the other physicians have noticed he's genuinely excited about cases again, instead of just going through motions. Colin comes straight to my apartment after the meeting, practically bouncing with excitement, and tells me this is the first time in almost a year that he's felt like himself at work. He's not using the hospital to hide from his feelings anymore. He's actually engaging with patients and colleagues, and the difference is obvious to everyone around him. Frank takes me aside one day when I'm at their house for a brief supervised dinner, and he thanks me for giving Colin another chance. He says watching Colin come back to life over the past few months has been incredible, seeing him laugh again and make plans for the future instead of just surviving day to day. Frank tells me he's committed to making sure Diane never threatens our relationship again, that he's prepared to choose his son's well-being over his wife's comfort if it comes to that. He admits he should have done that years ago, that his neutrality enabled Diane's controlling behavior, and he won't make that mistake again. I thank him for the support and tell him it means a lot that Colin has at least one parent fully in his corner. 6 months after Diane's desperate plea at my workplace, Colin and I are in a stable relationship with clear boundaries around his family. We have dinner with his parents once a month, always at a restaurant, always with a set end time. Diane is still in therapy and improving slowly, though she has setbacks where she reverts to old patterns, and Frank has to intervene. She's learning to ask about my day without making backhanded comments, to talk about Colin's work without suggesting he's making poor career choices by prioritizing our relationship. The progress is slow and imperfect, but it's progress, and Colin maintains the boundaries consistently, even when it's uncomfortable. We talk every week about how things are going, whether any concerns are building up, whether we're both still committed to making this work. So far, the answer is yes, and I'm starting to believe we might actually build something lasting this time, something that can withstand his mother's issues because we're both strong enough to hold the line together. Colin and I spent 2 weeks looking at apartments before we found the right one. It was a third-floor walk-up in a building neither of us had lived in before, with big windows that let in morning light and a kitchen that actually had counter space. We signed the lease on a Saturday, and Colin called his parents that night to tell them we were moving in together. Frank congratulated us immediately and said he was happy we were taking this step. Diane was quiet for a long moment before saying that was wonderful news and asking if we needed help with anything. Colin told her we had it covered, but we'd let her know when we were settled in. After he hung up, he looked at me and said he needed to set some ground rules with his mother before we actually moved. We drove to his parents' house the next day and sat down with both of them in their living room. Colin told Diane she could visit our new place, but she needed to call first and give us at least a day's notice. He said she would not be getting a key, and she couldn't just show up whenever she felt like it. Diane started to protest and say that seemed extreme for family, but Frank cut her off and told her those were reasonable boundaries that she needed to respect. She looked hurt and asked if I was the one who wanted these rules. Colin said no. He wanted them because he needed to know his home was his space and not somewhere his mother could invade. Diane's face went tight, but she agreed after Frank gave her a look that said she didn't have a choice. We moved in 3 weeks later, and Diane called 2 days beforehand to ask if she could bring us a housewarming gift. Colin said yes, and she showed up with a set of kitchen towels and a strained smile, staying for exactly 30 minutes before leaving without trying to snoop through our things. I'd been putting off dealing with James's stuff for weeks because I didn't want to face him after everything that happened. His sweatshirt was still in my closet, along with a book he'd left, and some running gear he'd forgotten. I texted him asking when would be a good time to return his things, and he said Saturday afternoon worked for him. We met at a coffee shop halfway between our places, and I brought everything in a shopping bag. James looked good, healthier than the last time I'd seen him, and there was a woman with him at a table in the corner. He introduced her as Sarah and said they'd been seeing each other for about a month. She seemed nice and gave me a friendly smile before excusing herself to get a refill on her coffee. James took the bag and thanked me for bringing his stuff. He said he was glad I figured out what I wanted, and he hoped things worked out with Colin. I told him I was sorry for how everything went down, for not being fully present when we were together. He said he understood, and he didn't regret our time together, because it taught him what he needed in a relationship. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing important, and then Sarah came back and James stood up to leave. He gave me a quick hug and told me to take care of myself, and I watched them walk out together feeling relieved that he'd moved on and wasn't angry with me. Colin planned a weekend trip to this little cabin in the mountains 2 hours from the city. He said he needed a break from the hospital and from family drama, and he wanted it to just be us. We drove up on a Friday afternoon and the place was perfect, small and quiet with a view of the lake. We spent Saturday hiking and cooking dinner together, and that night we sat on the porch watching the stars. Colin was quiet for a while, and then he got up and went inside, coming back with something in his hand. He sat down next to me and opened his palm to show me a ring, simple and silver with a small stone. He said he'd been carrying it around for 2 weeks waiting for the right moment. He told me he wanted to spend his life with me, that he promised we'd make all our decisions together without his mother running our lives. He said he knew things had been hard and complicated, but he believed we could build something real if we kept putting each other first. I looked at the ring and then at him, and I said yes, because I believed he was finally capable of keeping that promise. We sat there for a long time after, not saying much, just holding each other while the night got darker around us. 1 year after the breakup that nearly destroyed us both, Colin and I are planning our wedding and dealing with Diane's struggle to accept her limited role. We picked a date in the spring and booked a small venue that fits 100 people. Diane called 3 times in the first week after we announced our engagement, each time with suggestions about the guest list or the menu or the flowers. Colin shut her down every time and reminded her she could attend as a guest, but she didn't get to make decisions. She called Frank crying after the third conversation, and he called Colin to say he'd handle it. Frank took Diane to her therapy session, and apparently they spent an hour talking about boundaries and why she needed to let us plan our own wedding. She's been better since then, but she still slips up sometimes, mentioning how her friend's daughter had such a beautiful ceremony at the country club, or asking if we've considered a different color scheme. Colin stays firm every time, and I back him up, and slowly Diane is learning that her input isn't welcome unless we ask for it. We have dinner with his parents once a month, and it's still sometimes awkward, but Frank keeps Diane in check, and she's trying even when it's clearly hard for her. Our apartment feels like home now, full of our things and our routines, and we're building the life we should have had all along. It's not perfect and probably never will be with Diane in the picture, but it's genuinely ours, and that's enough.